The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and soft at first, like a shy visitor tapping at the windows. By evening, it had deepened into a rhythmic drumming, steady as a heartbeat, filling the little stone cottage with a sound both soothing and isolating. Outside, the world blurred, trees melted into shadowy shapes, their branches sagging under the weight of water. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint trace of lavender from the fire-warmed blankets. Isabel sat curled in her chair, a book resting half open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. She wasn't reading anymore. She was listening. Listening to the rain, yes, but also to the way it seemed to carry whispers. She had always loved storms. They gave her an excuse to stay indoors without guilt, to light the hearth and brew tea, to lose herself in worlds made of words. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness to the weather, as if the clouds were not simply spilling rain but pressing the sky downward. A low fog clung to the hills, and the forest beyond the cottage looked impossibly dark, its outlines shifting like something alive. Isabel caught herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, each time expecting to see. What, exactly? She couldn't say. The feeling was neither fear nor excitement, but a strange mixture of both. Like being on the brink of a story you haven't yet been told. The kettle whistled sharply, startling her into motion. She poured the steaming water over dried chamomile blossoms, watching the pale gold tendrils curl upward, scenting the air with something calming and floral. But even as she breathed it in, she couldn't shake the pull of the outside world. She moved to the window and pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. Beyond the rain-slicked panes, the path leading into the forest glistened faintly under the scattered light of the oil lamp. She imagined footsteps there, splashing softly in the puddles, an image so vivid that her chest tightened, though no one was in sight. When the knock came, it was almost too gentle to hear over the storm. A single tap, then another, then silence. Isabel froze, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. In her years living here, visitors were rare, and unannounced visitors at night were unheard of. She set her cup down and approached the door slowly, feeling the old wooden boards shift slightly beneath her weight. Another knock, firmer this time. She hesitated, then drew back the latch and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, though man seemed too simple a word for what she saw. His shoulders filled the doorway, his cloak dripping rain onto the threshold, and his eyes, deep, amber, and unblinking, held hers with a strange intensity. His features were striking, almost beautiful, but edged with something wild, untamed. Behind him, the forest swayed, and for an instant, Isabel thought she saw something else moving in the shadows beyond, something large and hulking, a shape that vanished the moment she blinked. Jacob kept driving, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, the image of the figure burning itself into his thoughts. The rain hammered harder, as if the storm itself wanted to smother the memory, but the more he tried to push it away, the more vivid it became. The pale face, the impossible smile. He turned the radio back on, desperate for a distraction, but the static drowned out the music, filling the car with a low hiss that set his nerves even more on edge. He switched it off, leaving only the drumming of rain and the occasional squeal of the wipers. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. He convinced himself it had been nothing but exhaustion, a trick of the storm. People didn't stand alone on deserted highways in the middle of the night, not unless they needed help. But hadn't he seen the way it smiled? That thought returned, sharper than before. He shivered, and for the first time in years, Jacob realized he was afraid to glance in the rearview mirror. Still, instinct won. He looked, and what he saw made his heart seize. There was someone sitting in the back seat. It was too dark to make out details, but the outline was there, slumped, still, almost blending into the shadows. For several long seconds, Jacob couldn't breathe. His mind scrambled, desperate for explanations. Had someone climbed into the car while he was at a red light? Was he imagining it? His trembling hand reached for the overhead light, but before he could switch it on, a sharp crack of thunder rolled through the night, rattling the windows. He jumped, and when he looked again, the back seat was empty. Jacob pulled onto the shoulder, chest heaving, headlights washing the road ahead. He pressed his palms into his eyes until stars burst against the darkness. This was impossible. He knew what he had seen. He could still feel it, the pressure in the air, the certainty of another presence behind him. A cold shudder ran down his spine. He whispered to himself that he was just tired, that he needed to keep driving, that home was less than half an hour away. But his voice shook, and deep down he wasn't sure if he believed a word of it. The car crept back onto the road, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Jacob forced his eyes forward, refusing to glance at the mirror again. Yet a thought gnawed at him as he drove. Sometimes, the scariest part of a storm wasn't the rain or the thunder. Sometimes it was what the storm hid and what it let through. Jacob drove faster than he meant to, the steady roar of rain nearly swallowing the sound of his engine. His shoulders ached from how tightly he clutched the wheel. He told himself over and over that it had been a trick of the eyes, just shadows, just exhaustion. But no matter how many times he repeated it, the memory of that silhouette in the back seat clung to him like damp clothes. The highway stretched on endlessly, yet he couldn't shake the thought that if he looked in the mirror again, he might not be alone. Relief came unexpectedly. A flickering sign in the distance, neon red against the gray curtain of rain. A gas station. Its canopy lights hummed faintly, glowing through the storm like a beacon. Jacob pulled in with a shaky breath, the tires splashing across deep puddles. He parked beneath the shelter, the rain hammering down beyond the fluorescent glow. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at his fogged windows, convincing himself he'd be safe as long as he stayed in the light. The station was nearly empty. Only one other car sat on the far side, a beat-up pickup truck with mud caked along the wheels. Its bed was uncovered, rain pooling in the corners, but Jacob noticed something odd. The driver's side door hung slightly open, swaying with the wind. No one was inside. He scanned the lot, half hoping, half dreading to see movement. Nothing. The air was thick, the kind of silence that made even the buzzing lights sound deafening. Finally, Jacob stepped out. The rain was colder than he expected, soaking his jacket in seconds as he hurried toward the convenience store. He tried to shake off the fear, to laugh at himself for being jumpy. But then, as he glanced back at his car, he froze. There was condensation on the rear passenger window, the kind that forms when someone breathes too close to the glass. He stood rooted to the spot, rain dripping from his hair, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the storm. He had been alone when he parked. He was certain of it. With shaking hands, Jacob pushed into the store, the bell above the door jingling weakly. A bored-looking attendant glanced up from the counter, offering a lazy nod. The warmth and fluorescent light should have been comforting, but Jacob couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was still waiting outside, unseen in the storm. He grabbed a coffee he didn't want, anything to give him an excuse to stay under the buzzing lights a little longer. Inside the gas station, the humming lights seemed too bright, too artificial, as though they were trying too hard to disguise the darkness pressing against the glass walls. Jacob sipped the bitter coffee he didn't want, trying to stop his hands from shaking. He told himself again that the fog on the rear window could have been nothing, maybe his own breath lingering from when he parked. But the certainty in his gut told him otherwise. The attendant, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair, leaned on the counter with his chin propped in his palm. His eyes flicked to Jacob once, then back to the small TV in the corner showing muted infomercials. Jacob thought about asking him if he'd seen anyone outside, someone lurking near the cars, but the word stuck in his throat. It sounded insane. Instead, he muttered a quiet, "Thanks," and paid for the coffee, though the man barely acknowledged it. Just as Jacob turned to leave, thunder rattled the windows. The power flickered, plunging the store into near darkness before the lights snapped back on. Jacob's eyes darted instinctively toward the glass wall facing the lot. His car was still there, parked under the canopy. But there was something new, movement. A figure, unmistakable, leaning against the side of his sedan as though it belonged there. The angle was wrong to see clearly, but he could make out a bent head, shoulders hunched, like someone waiting for him. "Hey," Jacob said sharply, his voice cracking in the silence. The attendant grunted without looking up. Jacob turned back to him. "Did you see that? Out there, someone by my car." The man finally dragged his gaze from the TV, peering through the glass. He squinted, frowned, then shook his head. "Ain't nobody out there," he muttered, already turning back to his show. But Jacob kept staring. because even as the attendant dismissed it, the figure outside slowly lifted its head. And though rain streaked the glass between them, Jacob saw the smile, unnaturally wide, too many teeth visible in the lightning's brief illumination. Jacob's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything: the hum of the lights, the patter of rain, even his own shaky breathing. The figure outside hadn't moved since lifting its head, but the weight of its stare pressed against him, even through the glass. He could feel it, like invisible fingers tightening around his chest. He wanted to scream at the attendant to look again, to take him seriously, but the words jammed in his throat. The power flickered once more, plunging the store into darkness for 2 full seconds this time. When the lights came back, Jacob's car was still there, but the figure was gone. Not walking away, not retreating into the storm. Gone. His skin crawled with the realization that it could be anywhere now. In the shadows beyond the pumps. Around the corner of the building. Maybe even inside. He stumbled backward from the window, heart hammering. The attendant shot him an annoyed look. "You okay, buddy?" he muttered, as though Jacob were the strangest thing in the room. Jacob wanted to shout that something was wrong, that they needed to lock the doors, call the police, anything. But before he could speak, the bell over the entrance gave a sharp ding. The door creaked open. A gust of rain and wind swept in, rattling the rack of cheap umbrellas near the entrance. No one stood in the doorway. The rain poured in thick sheets outside, the parking lot a blur of gray. Jacob's throat closed. He was certain he saw the door handle move, saw it open with intent. And yet, nothing came in. The bell jingled once more as the door eased shut on its own. The attendant shook his head, muttering, "Damn storm." But Jacob couldn't move his eyes from the door. His gut screamed that the figure was closer now, that it hadn't disappeared, only slipped between the seconds of the storm, watching, waiting. And as he stood there trembling, the condensation returned to his car's rear window, a faint oval of fog forming, as if something inside had just exhaled. Jacob stood frozen in the store, his body trembling with the same jittery rhythm as the fluorescent lights overhead. He couldn't stop staring at the window. That oval of fog on his car's rear glass wasn't just a trick. He knew it. Something was inside. His throat worked as he tried to swallow, but his mouth was bone dry. The attendant had gone back to ignoring him, flipping through a magazine, leaving Jacob completely alone with his spiraling fear. He told himself he could call the police. But the thought of explaining it, telling some dispatcher that a smiling stranger might have broken into his car and maybe also vanished into thin air, felt insane. And what if the police didn't come fast enough? What if, by the time they arrived, it was already too late? Jacob glanced down at his shaking hands, realizing he was gripping the keys so tightly the metal dug into his skin. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay inside, he knew he was going back out there. The rain swallowed him instantly, cold and heavy, drumming against his head and shoulders as he stepped off the curb. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, eyes locked on the dark shape of his sedan beneath the canopy. Lightning streaked across the sky, bathing the parking lot in a brief, unnatural daylight. And for that split second, Jacob thought he saw someone in the driver's seat, a shadow leaning forward, watching him. Then darkness returned, and the car sat still till he reached the door, heart pounding so hard it hurt. His breath came in shallow bursts. Hands trembling, he yanked open the driver's side door and slid inside, locking it behind him. The familiar smell of stale fast food wrappers and air freshener filled his nose, grounding him just enough to keep him steady. He turned, slowly, toward the back seat. Empty. Just shadows, floor mats, and silence. No figure. No breath. Nothing. He let out a ragged laugh that was closer to a sob, clutching the steering wheel as if it might anchor him. But then, the rearview mirror shifted. Not the angle. He had adjusted it earlier and hadn't touched it since. The glass itself rippled, faintly, as though someone had breathed on it from the other side. And there, in that warped reflection, was the smile again, wide, stretching impossibly far across a pale face staring back at him from the seat directly behind. Jacob's scream caught in his throat, coming out instead as a strangled gasp. He twisted in his seat, whipping his head toward the back. The seat was empty, just fabric, shadows, and the faint smell of wet upholstery. But the mirror didn't lie. He could still see it there, reflected in trembling glass. That face, grinning so wide the cheeks seemed on the verge of tearing. The rain pounded harder, drumming like fists against the roof. Jacob squeezed his eyes shut and tried to breathe, but the air inside the car felt thick, as if it belonged to someone else. A hot wave of dizziness crashed through him. When he opened his eyes again, the rearview mirror was fogging over entirely, like someone breathing against it from behind the glass. And then, letters, smudged by invisible fingers. Slowly, shakily, a word appeared. RID. Jacob's chest tightened, his pulse surging in his ears. His hand shot to the ignition, fumbling with the keys. The engine coughed to life, headlights cutting across the rain, and he slammed the car into drive. The sedan lurched forward, tires screeching against the slick pavement, fishtailing as it shot back onto the empty highway. He told himself if he just kept driving, if he put enough miles behind him, this nightmare would dissolve. But no matter how fast the wipers beat, he couldn't clear the windshield. Shapes seemed to move in the blur of water. Faces, reaching hands, shifting shadows. He risked a glance at the mirror, against every instinct. His blood froze. The back seat wasn't empty anymore. The figure was there now, fully, impossibly, hunched forward between the seats. Its soaked hair clung to its pale forehead, and that stretched, hideous smile shone even in the dark. Its eyes, black as the storm itself, locked on his. Jacob's breath hitched as the figure tilted its head, like it was studying him or savoring the fear rolling off him. Jacob swerved, nearly losing control. "Get out," he shouted, his voice breaking. His hand slipped on the wheel. He dared another look. This time the seat was empty again. Just wet fabric. No figure. But the mirror still showed it, closer than ever, lips parting into a grin that revealed rows of jagged, too sharp teeth. The storm roared louder, as if the rain itself was laughing with it. Jacob's knuckles burned white against the wheel as he tore down the flooded highway, tires hissing over slick asphalt. The wipers swiped furiously, but the storm was a living wall, blinding him in waves. His heart pounded so violently it hurt, but he didn't dare slow down. The mirror still reflected that figure, closer now, its grin pressed against the glass as if it were peering through the surface of the world itself. The hand clamped down on his shoulder. Cold, wet, real. Jacob screamed, the car swerving hard onto the shoulder. His vision blurred with terror as he slapped at the phantom grip, but the seat beside him was empty. Nothing but the passenger belt swaying. Yet the weight lingered on his skin, freezing him to the bone. He tried to focus, tried to steady the wheel, but another touch came. This time fingers brushing the back of his neck, slick and clammy. The radio burst alive with static. Not music, not voices, just a wet hiss, punctuated by faint words breaking through the distortion. His ears strained against it, but the harder he listened, the clearer it became. A whisper, layered over itself in countless tones, male and female, young and old, all saying the same word. Ride. Louder. Closer. Filling the car until it drowned out the storm itself. Lightning struck ahead, so close it blinded him. For a heartbeat, the entire car lit up inside, and Jacob saw it, really saw it. The figure wasn't in the back anymore. It was crouched on the roof, face pressed upside down against the windshield, that impossible grin smeared across the glass. Rain streaked around its pale head as it stared straight into his eyes, teeth gnashing as if it were chewing through the barrier between them. Jacob panicked. He jerked the wheel hard, the sedan fishtailing across the lane before slamming into the guardrail. Metal screamed. The airbag exploded into his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. The car spun once, twice, before skidding to a stop, headlights half submerged in a ditch. Steam and rain hissed off the crumpled hood. Dazed, bleeding, Jacob tried to lift his head, ears ringing. The storm had quieted for the first time that night, and in the unnatural silence, he heard it again, right behind his ear. A wet whisper, "Move over." The airbag sagged against Jacob's chest as he fought to draw in breath. His ears rang, head swimming, but that whisper still clung to him, brushing across the shell of his ear like cold lips. "Move over." He snapped his head sideways, terrified of what he might see, but the passenger seat was still empty. Only the faint drip-drip of rain from his jacket filled the silence. His shaking hand reached for the door handle, desperate to get out, but the locks clicked down on their own, each one snapping shut in unison. The dashboard lights flickered, dimmed, and then the engine roared to life, though Jacob hadn't touched the keys. His foot wasn't on the pedal, but the RPMs climbed anyway, the whole car vibrating as though something else had taken hold. He tried to slam it into park, but the gearshift refused to move, locked in place by an invisible grip. His panic rose with the revs of the engine, each one shaking the car harder, until he was certain the whole vehicle would tear itself apart. Then the rearview mirror tilted by itself, angling down toward him. In its warped reflection, Jacob saw the figure hunched low in the back seat again, its long, dripping fingers stretching forward, almost touching his shoulders. He spun around, shouting, but the seat was empty. When he faced forward again, a pale handprint appeared on the inside of the windshield, pressed from nowhere, sliding slowly downward as if someone unseen were crawling forward. The car jolted suddenly, shoving Jacob against the seat. The seatbelt tightened across his chest like a hand pinning him down. He clawed at the buckle, gasping, but it wouldn't release. Then came the sound, something scratching along the roof, nails dragging slow and deliberate across the metal. The storm outside surged, rain pelting harder, the wind howling like voices. It felt as though the entire storm had turned its focus onto him, waiting for what came next, and then, with a shudder, the passenger door swung open. Rain and wind blasted in, soaking him instantly, and for one terrible moment Jacob swore he saw a shape standing in the torrent, a tall, pale silhouette with its head tilted and its smile gleaming even through the downpour. The seatbelt jerked tight around him as if pulling him sideways, dragging him toward the open door, toward the waiting storm. Jacob screamed, his voice lost in the roar, as invisible hands tugged him closer to the threshold. Jacob fought against the tightening seatbelt until his arms went numb. The strap dug deep into his chest, each breath harder than the last. Rain whipped through the open door, soaking everything, stinging his skin like needles. The figure stood just beyond the threshold, its silhouette blurred by the downpour, but that smile, unnatural, gleaming, never faltered. Its head cocked slowly to one side, and Jacob realized it wasn't waiting. It was inviting. The car shuddered violently, engine roaring though no foot touched the pedal. The headlights flickered, flashing glimpses of the storm as if the night itself were blinking. Jacob clawed desperately at the buckle, nails tearing against the plastic. His vision blurred, breath shortening, when suddenly the belt snapped free. He spilled sideways across the seat, his shoulders slamming hard against the passenger door. For an instant, he thought he was free, but invisible hands seized him, cold, wet, stronger than steel, and yanked him toward the open doorway. He grabbed the frame, knuckles splitting against metal, screaming into the storm. Lightning tore the sky, and for one split second he saw it fully. A pale, waterlogged figure crouched in the passenger seat beside him, its head inches from his own, eyes bottomless, teeth stretched wide in a grin that promised nothing human. "Ride's over," it whispered, though its lips didn't move that Jacob's grip failed. He was ripped from the car into the storm, his scream cutting off as the rain swallowed him. The door slammed shut, the locks clicked down, and silence fell inside the wrecked sedan. The engine sputtered and died, headlights fading until the car was nothing but a dark husk in the ditch. Rain pattering softly against its broken frame. 2 days later, a county tow truck pulled the sedan from the mud. The officers who inspected it logged the crash as single vehicle, likely fatigue-related. No driver was found inside. But the report mentioned something odd, a detail quickly buried. The inside of every window was fogged over, as though someone had been breathing heavily in the dark for hours. And across the rear windshield, written in smeared condensation, was a single word: ride.